Listen. That is the sound of the 21st century. It is the sound of commerce, of war, of holidays, of globalization. We take this roar for granted, but 80 years ago, this sound didn't exist. It was scientifically impossible, a fantasy. Until one man, ignored, ridiculed, and pushed to the brink of collapse, decided to bottle a hurricane. In 1928, speed had a ceiling. You could put a bigger engine on a plane, add more propellers, burn more fuel, but eventually you hit a wall. The propeller itself. At high speeds, a propeller loses its grip on the air. It becomes useless dead weight. Aviation experts agreed. 500 miles per hour was the limit, the absolute end of the line. Enter Frank Whittle, the son of a mechanic from Coventry. He wasn't born into the aristocracy of the Royal Air Force. He was a commoner, short, scrappy, a daredevil pilot who once crashed a plane because he was bored with flying straight. He didn't just want to fly, he wanted to fly fast. While other cadets were drinking in the mess hall, Whittle was obsessing over a thesis. His idea was radical in its simplicity. Throw away the propeller, throw away the pistons, take air, suck it in, squeeze it until it's screaming, burn it, and blast it out the back. Newton's third law. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. If you blast gas back hard enough, the aeroplane must go forward. No propellers, no speed limit. He took his idea to the Air Ministry in 1929. He handed them the keys to the future, and they laughed. Their report was devastatingly dull. Scientific investigation has proven that the gas turbine could never be a practical impossibility. They didn't just say no, they said it was physics-breaking nonsense. They told him the metals would melt, the fuel consumption would be astronomical. They told him to go back to his squad and stop dreaming. If the experts told you your life's work was scientifically impossible, would you have scrapped the idea or kept going? Be honest. This is where most stories end. The expert says no, the inventor gives up. But Whittle possessed a dangerous quality. He knew he was right. He patented the idea himself. It cost him £75, a fortune for a junior officer. But here is the tragedy. The British government, blinded by tradition, refused to put the invention on the secret list. Do you know what that means? It means the plans for the jet engine, the most powerful military technology of the 20th century, were published in public records. Anyone could read them, including the German embassy. While Britain slept, the clock began to tick. In Germany, a young physicist named Hans von Ohain had a similar idea. He didn't have Whittle's head start, but he had something Whittle didn't, a government that was hungry for superweapons. Whittle was running a race he didn't even know had started, and he was running it with weights tied to his ankles. 1936. The clouds of war are gathering over Europe. Whittle, with a few scraps of private investment, forms a company, Power Jets Limited. It sounds grand. It wasn't. It was a few men in a leaky foundry in Rugby. They had no money for specialised tools. They were building the most sophisticated machine in history using scrap metal and sheer willpower. April 12th, 1937. The day the world changed, though nobody heard it yet. Whittle opens the fuel valve. The pilot burner is lit. The starter motor whines. 1,000 RPM. 2,000 RPM. The engine wakes up. But then, something terrifying happens. The engine goes out of control. The paraffin ignites uncontrollably. The rev counter spins off the dial. 8,000, 9,000 RPM. The scream is deafening. It's a banshee wail that pierces the skull. Whittle doesn't run. He stands there, watching his creation, paralysed by a mix of terror and awe. The heat is so intense the metal glows cherry red. It looks like it's going to explode and take the whole building with it. And then, silence. The fuel runs out. The beast sleeps. They didn't die. And more importantly, it worked. For a few terrifying seconds, they had created thrust without a propeller. They had bottled the hurricane. But the Air Ministry was still unimpressed. "Interesting toy," they said, "but can you put it in a plane?" The stress began to eat him alive. Whittle was working 18-hour days. He was fighting the laws of physics in the morning and the laws of bureaucracy in the afternoon. He developed nasty rashes. He suffered from dizzy spells. He was popping Benzedrine just to stay awake and sedatives to sleep. He was a man on the edge of a nervous breakdown. And all the while, the German war machine was moving. 1939, war is declared. Suddenly, the Air Ministry needs miracles. They come knocking on the door of the man they ignored for a decade. "That toy of yours," they ask, "can it fly?" Whittle, exhausted, sick, and underfunded, has to make a choice. Does he tell them to get lost? Or does he save the country that ridiculed him? Do you think the government deserves the technology after ignoring him for 10 years? He builds it. The W1 engine. They mount it inside a strange, small plane, the Gloster E-28-39. It has no propeller. To the casual observer, it looks incomplete, a glider that forgot its engine. May 15th, 1941. Cranwell, a soggy British field. The test pilot climbs in. Whittle isn't even watching the runway. He's staring at the temperature gauges, praying the turbine blades don't melt and slice the pilot in half. The throttle is pushed forward. The grass behind the plane is scorched black. And then, the impossible happens. The plane doesn't just lift off, it leaps. It climbs into the grey sky effortlessly. No propeller blurring the view, just a sleek shark moving through water. The RAF officers watching drop their binoculars. They are seeing a ghost. At that moment, every other plane in the sky, the Spitfires, the Messerschmitts, the Mustangs, became obsolete. They were flying museum pieces. Frank Whittle had done it. He had proved them all wrong. But as he watched his creation disappear into the clouds, he didn't know that his hardest battle wasn't against gravity, it was against his own allies. Because while Whittle was making history, the vultures were circling to steal his company, his patent, and his legacy. May 1941. Frank Whittle had achieved the impossible. He had proved that a plane could fly without a propeller. The squirt, as they affectionately called it, was a triumph of British engineering. But in war, being right isn't enough. You have to be fast. Whittle thought the hard work was over. He thought the Air Ministry would finally give him the resources to build a fleet of jets to sweep the Luftwaffe from the skies. He was wrong. The engineering battle was won. The political war was just beginning. Enter the Americans. General Hap Arnold, head of the US Army Air Forces, visited Britain in 1941. He was shown the top-secret Whittle jet. He was stunned. The Americans were still tinkering with piston engines, while this British boffin had unlocked the future. Arnold made a request. He wanted the plans. And he wanted an engine. The British government, desperate for American support, agreed. In October 1941, Whittle's prototype engine, the W.1X, was crated up. Along with a stack of blueprints, it was flown across the Atlantic to the General Electric plant in Massachusetts. It was a transfer of technology worth billions. Britain essentially handed the keys to the jet age to the United States on a silver platter. And they did it for free. There is a famous story about the American engineers unpacking Whittle's engine. They looked at the bearings and scratched their heads. "Where are the rest of the parts?" they asked. "This can't possibly work." It was too simple, too elegant. But it did work. Within 6 months, the Americans had built their own version. They had the industrial might, the money, and the factories that Whittle could only dream of. While Whittle was begging for scraps of aluminium in Rugby, the Americans were preparing to mass-produce his invention. Back in Britain, things were getting ugly. The ministry decided that Whittle's tiny company, Turbojet, couldn't handle mass production. They were right. He didn't have the factories. So, they forced him into a partnership with Rover. Yes, the car manufacturers. It was a disaster from day one. Rover's engineers were used to piston engines. Heavy, complicated, precise things. They looked at Whittle's gas turbine and tried to fix it. They changed the design without telling him. They added useless modifications. They treated Whittle not as the inventor, but as a nuisance. Whittle was furious. He was watching his baby being deformed by people who didn't understand the basic physics of how it worked. He later said, "It was like watching a surgeon operate on a patient with a pickaxe." The stress returned. The rashes flared up. The headaches were blinding. He was fighting a war on two fronts, the Nazis in Europe and the car makers in Coventry. And while the British squabbled in boardrooms, the enemy was busy. July 18th, 1942. German test pilot Fritz Wendel climbs into the Messerschmitt Me 262. It didn't just have one jet engine, it had two. It was swept wing, aggressive, and terrifyingly fast. Germany had won the race to the air. The Me 262 flew 9 months before the British Gloster Meteor entered service. The Swallow, that's what they called it. It could fly at 540 miles per hour. A Spitfire pilot could dive at it, engine screaming, and the German jet would simply accelerate away as if the British plane were standing still. If Hitler had mass-produced this plane earlier, the D-Day landings might have been a massacre. The skies over Europe would have belonged to the Luftwaffe. Finally, in 1944, the British jet entered service, the Gloster Meteor, powered by Whittle's engines. But the RAF was terrified of their own secret weapon falling into enemy hands. They issued a strict order. The Meteor is forbidden from flying over enemy territory. So, what did they do with the world's most advanced fighter? They used it for home defence, specifically against the V-1 flying bomb. The V-1 was a pulse jet cruise missile, fast, loud, and deadly. Propeller planes struggled to catch them. But the Meteor? The Meteor could catch them. On August 4th, 1944, Flying Officer Dixie Dean was on patrol. He spotted a V-1 heading for London. He pushed his throttle. The Whittle engines roared. He caught up to the bomb. But his guns jammed. Disaster. The bomb was ticking. London was minutes away. Dean didn't give up. He did something insane. He flew his jet wingtip to wingtip with the flying bomb. He used the airflow over his wing to physically tip the V-1 over. The bomb's gyroscope toppled. It spun out of control and crashed harmlessly into a field. It was the first time in history a jet aircraft had defeated a missile. Whittle's engine was finally saving lives. By 1945, the war was ending. The Allies had won. The jet age had arrived. Frank Whittle should have been the wealthiest, most celebrated engineer in the empire. He had given Britain the lead in the most important technology of the century. But the government had one final surprise for him. They didn't give him a knighthood. They didn't give him a fortune. They nationalised his company. Powerjets Limited was forcibly taken over by the state. He was told he could stay on as a technical advisor, but he would no longer be in charge of his own invention. They took his engine, they took his company, and they handed the manufacturing contracts to the very giants, Rolls-Royce and Rover, that had fought him for years. He resigned in protest. He was 41 years old. He had changed the world, and in return, the establishment chewed him up and spat him out. The man who shrank the world was now unemployed. While the government divided up the spoils of his invention among the big corporations, Rolls-Royce, Bristol, Rover, Whittle was left with nothing to command. He was a furious genius with no laboratory. In 1948, the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors decided to settle the debt. They looked at the jet engine, an invention that would soon be worth trillions of pounds to the global economy, and they wrote him a cheque. £100,000, tax-free. It was a fortune in those days, but was it enough? He had given the world the keys to the sky. He had shortened global travel from weeks to hours, and in return, they gave him a payout and a gentle push towards the door. The message from the British establishment was clear. "Thank you, Air Commodore. We'll take it from here." Disillusioned, Whittle did what many great British pioneers have done when their homeland failed to appreciate them. He left. In 1976, he emigrated to the United States. The irony was bitter. The Americans, who had received his technology for free during the war, treated him like royalty. They saw him not as a nuisance, but as a titan. He became a research professor at the US Naval Academy. He was feted in Washington. The country that borrowed his genius was the only one that truly knew how to honour it. But the most extraordinary moment of his later life wasn't an award. It was a meeting. Decades after the war, Frank Whittle finally met Hans von Ohain, the British genius and the German genius. They had spent the war trying to destroy each other's countries. They had been running the same race in parallel lanes, separated by a wall of silence. But when they met, there was no animosity, only recognition. They became the best of friends. They toured the world together, giving lectures. The Jet Pioneers, they were called. Von Ohain once told Whittle the truth that haunts historians to this day. He said, "If the British government had backed you sooner, the Luftwaffe would never have stood a chance. You would have swept us from the sky in 1940. And Whittle replied, "And if Hitler had backed you sooner, London would have been dust." Two men, two engines, and a world that hung in the balance between them. Frank Whittle died in Maryland in 1996. He didn't die a billionaire. He didn't own the companies that built his engines. But his legacy is written in the sky, 30,000 feet above our heads. Every time you board a plane to go on holiday, every time a package arrives from the other side of the world in 24 hours, every time you hear that distant roar high in the clouds, you are living in the world Frank Whittle built. They told him it was impossible. They told him the physics wouldn't work. They told him he was just a cadet with a crazy idea. But the boy from Coventry didn't listen. He simply reached out, grabbed the future, and pulled it towards him. In the end, the boffin won. The pistons stopped, and the world started to fly.